Well, the history of disabled persons in our country often includes stories of exclusion and oppression. Several decades ago, the deinstitutionalization of people with disabilities began, and since then, disability culture has been able to flourish. Today on the show, we're exploring the topic of disability culture, the shared art, knowledge, and traditions of the community. We'll be joined by a freelance journalist, a former Paralympian, and a multi-disciplinary artist, and we want you to join the conversation too. Are you a member of the disabled community? How would you define disability culture? You can get in touch, 1-800-716-2221, or email bluesky@cbc.ca. Well, John Lepke is a disabled freelance journalist and theater artist. He recently published a first-person piece, including this video for CBC as part of a series called Taking a Sitting Stand.
I need you to see disability as a culture, not in medical terms, not as a state of oppression, but through the lens of our history, our people, and our traditions. And allies, you can come along too. Hi, I'm John Lepke, disabled freelance journalist and theater artist, and today we're going to talk about disability as a culture.
In the mid-1900s, you saw the rise of the disability rights movement. It largely focused on accessibility and moving disabled people from institutions to living in the wider community. People only really started to see disability as a culture about 30 years ago, and even that's a point of contention.
The important part is that people began to see the shared lived experiences of disability as a culture. It means shared knowledge, like how to understand yourself as disabled, how to build community, and how to welcome others into it. It also means beginning and sustaining traditions, like marking Disability Day of Mourning or Disability Pride Month. Seeing disability as a culture reinforces that it is something that you are a part of, rather than something that is just happening to you, and that leads people to connect. As an artist, if I understand Frida Kahlo or Beethoven as disabled, it helps me imagine myself in that space. And when I see disabled artists expressing their disability through their art, it encourages me to do the same. For example, Frida Kahlo painted her back brace, and Canada's Carmen Papalia designs creative wayfinding. Here in Saskatchewan, I'm involved with a nonprofit for disabled artists and collaborators called Listen to Dis Community Arts. And I can honestly say that without their support and skill building, I would not be in front of this camera today. Or, to pull from another part of my life, if you understand the Paralympics or the Special Olympics as part of disability culture, you begin to see rich international traditions. Canada has been highly visible within the Paralympic movement since the beginning. Wheelchair rugby, which has its origins just one province over from me in Manitoba, is a heritage sport. That means it was created here and is understood as being part of Canada's historical contributions to the sports world. So, disability culture allows us to see our identities not as a weird set of coincidences, but as a kinship. Understanding disability as a culture also adds fuel to accessibility arguments. For example, when you see deafness as a culture, you don't see sign language interpreting and captioning as a nice to have. You see them as a non-negotiable part of helping people connect. I should acknowledge that there's no one disability culture. There's a long history of culture specific to deaf communities, for example, and differences between regions, races, and other cultures. Regardless of its form, disability culture shows that we are worthy of care and worthy of preservation. For most people, becoming disabled is inevitable. So, start informing yourself now. Learn about disabled people in your community, in your areas of interest. It'll pay off. Disability culture allows us to enter into disabled life with more support and self-compassion.
That's a video piece freelance journalist John Lepke recently created along with CBC. And John Lepke joins us right now. Welcome to Blue Sky, John.
Thank you for having me.
Why was disability as a culture something you wanted to get the word out about?
Absolutely. So I started my disability cultural journey, if we can call it that, within parasport. I would say that I got to go to a bunch of cool stuff, but never anything important. And eventually that led into the artwork and the journalism work. And really, it is so powerful, I think, and so freeing to be able to think about disability as a culture and as a way of connecting rather than just as, a list of diagnoses that we end up with, or, as you mentioned earlier, that there's so much negative that can come with disability, that being able to see it as a culture and being able to have those deep and rich conversations really, really has had value for me and has informed the way that I live and I work.
What was it like putting this piece together? Did you learn anything that surprised you?
Well, first of all, I love working with the team at CBC, including the whole team that made this video. So, I can't talk about the project without being thankful for the opportunity to do that. I think what was interesting is this piece led on from another piece in a way that I wrote the definition of disability culture for the Canadian Encyclopedia. And going back and looking at, when did we first mention this? When did we first understand it as a culture? And seeing, not just, I knew it was recent, but just how that conversation, which as is often true in disability circles, starts with academia and then eventually filters down. We're starting to see disability culture filter down into the non-academic spaces. I think I was surprised by, the pockets in which disability culture was existing in more loudly. And so that was really interesting to build into this broader piece.
I'm wondering, John, about your own journey of how you initially felt about your own disability and how your perception of that evolved over time, leading you to now embracing disability culture.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that early on, certainly my high school years, I wouldn't say that I was super proud of being disabled. I've grown to love this phrase that I don't know who I borrowed or grabbed it from, but I can be proud of my body and be happy with my body without being proud of my symptoms. It took me a really long time to get there. I can love my body without loving my symptoms, and that. Early on, I moved to Canada when I was 11. Really early on in my childhood, I have a sibling with a disability as well, and that is radically different from mine. And early on, I was really ableist, and in some ways, it's hard to admit that now. But I was like, intellectually and developmentally disabled people over there. I'm over here in this physical disability realm. That's totally different. And being able to unpack that, going and being able to play parasport, as I mentioned, wheelchair basketball, wheelchair rugby, going on to do the disability art stuff, it was a long unpacking. I think I got over I can't be around other disabled people fairly quickly, but the coming to understand it as a culture has been a longer path.
Was there a specific moment where you maybe heard the term disability culture, or where you were like, oh, this is interesting, I want to think more about this?
I think it was being involved in some of the arts work, and I got to work with Listen to This at one point as an arts administrator and learning, other theater companies and other arts companies that were doing other work in other provinces. I will save listeners the full name drop. They can find that elsewhere. But there was this sort of sense that disability was building as a culture. I'm also... as I mentioned, I was born in Britain. Britain is in a lot of ways the birthplace of disability culture, and so, or where it first was popularized. So there was a little bit of that, and seeing, keeping tabs as much as one can, living across the world from it, as to what was happening there, and I think it just sort of all grew into this point where I was like, oh, no, this is a term we should be using more.
So in your view then, what exactly defines disability culture? I have to admit, when I was researching for this, there wasn't really one key definition. So what is your definition of it, and how exactly do you think it differs from, mainstream perceptions of perhaps medical understandings of disabilities?
Yeah, this is going to be where I'm bad at quoting myself, but as said in the wonderful intro, and maybe you get to quote it back to me at some point, but I see it and in the research that I've done as the language and the traditions and the community of disability. And because it's early on, and because the disability community, depending on who you ask, data is a funny thing. 20 to 25% of the population. It really depends who you ask. But I see it as the traditions. A lot of the time when we talk about disability culture, we're talking about it as synonymous, as a synonym to disability art. But as a parasport athlete, I think there is space, and certainly I think even on the academic side, the athletes who have become academics would give space to parasport as well, being part of those traditions.
I'm Candice Lipsky. You are listening to Blue Sky here on CBC Radio 1. That's 540 AM across the province, 94.1 FM in Saskatoon, 102.5 FM in Regina, and you can take us with you anywhere on the CBC Listen app. Today we are talking about disability culture, and we'd love to hear your thoughts as well. You can get in touch, 1-800-716-2221, or you can email bluesky@cbc.ca. Now, John, earlier we listened to the video you worked on, amazing work. And one of the communities you described in there, and as you've mentioned, you've partaken in, of having a long history of disability culture is the Paralympics. And so we wanted to track down a Paralympian to talk about that as well. So Shauna Ryan is a former member of Canada's national goalball team and competed at the 2008 Paralympic Games in Beijing. She also attended the 2016 Paralympic Games in paracycling. Shauna is sight impaired and can see 20/200 while using visual aids, and she joins us now at the Saskatoon studio. Hello, Shauna.
Hi, so nice to be here.
I'm so happy to have you. As you've been listening to John talking about all of this, what is going through your mind?
Well, it really had me reflecting very thoroughly over the last 24 hours, watching his very provocative pieces, taking a look at and challenging, how we look at the culture of disability. And I mean, I certainly would echo some of John's earlier experience. I tried to just fit in as much as I could as a young person. I'm like, how did I get through grade 11 and 12 algebra just pretending I could see the board? So, kudos to me, I guess, because I passed somehow without even being able to know what was being presented. Anyways, but a foolhardy notion. Obviously, I didn't do myself any favors. But as I became involved in sport, I really rediscovered the bravery and the advocacy and the pride I could have in being a person who has different abilities than others. So as I think about the culture of disability, I think about it shifting, culture change for myself, but then culture change in the broader culture as well, where we think about how we can change it from within and how we can have the broader culture learn more about how the subculture acts, believes, perseveres, shows bravery. So from within and from without, I'm excited about culture change and how John has presented it.
What kind of culture would you say that the Paralympics fosters?
So much diversity and excitement and darn hard work. Like being an athlete, regardless of your abilities, it's a full-time job and it's a lot of hard work. So I think it is really, it really made me challenge my limits in every area of my life. And I think a lot of athletes would say the same thing. I discovered new limits, things that I never thought I could do or accomplish. And then, I 100%, and maybe this sounds kind of cheesy or cliche, but I really feel like I've taken those principles and can now apply them professionally as a parent, in all areas of my life. So, it's 100% changed my life.
Wow. We have another guest listening who has been in our Regina studio. Carla Harris is a multi-disciplinary artist and an entrepreneur in Regina. And they join us for this conversation too. Hi, Carla.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. First off, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and the disability you live with?
Sure. Candice, I grew up, actually, Shauna made such a good example there talking about vision. So I grew up with a health condition, epilepsy, but the beauty was that I wasn't aware of that, right? Like what you're born with is all you actually know. And so you don't know if you are receiving information differently than other people or if you are responding differently in learning settings like schools and that sort of thing. So it wasn't until I was actually in my master's that I was diagnosed. Mm-hmm. And, it was another 9 years, actually, after that, and even having like brain surgery to manage my seizures, that I started to actually learn about disability culture and started to read these things because, we're a generation who never talked about that sort of stuff, and the kids that were sent to a different classroom who needed different types of assistance. There was a very condition-based, sort of separate mindset of the people around us as opposed to coming from us as to what we actually need. And we hadn't had a chance to really explore that. So I had a really wrong, terrible misconception about what it would, maybe that everybody would think I don't have a condition bad enough to count. And so once I finally found authors and artists and, public speakers talking about disability as a culture, it has changed my life completely. I've had such growth since that time.
Carla, you just said something and it elicited a reaction from both of our other guests. John, do you want to tell me what you're laughing about?
I think it's just the knowing chuckle that comes with, not to root us all back again, but back to disability culture of, it may look radically different. And Carla, I'm not speaking for you, but, it may look radically different for me. I have cerebral palsy. That looks, in my case, radically different from epilepsy. But it was still, I was 24 when I realized I have chronic pain. Mm-hmm. I think I've had chronic pain since I was like 13. Like it takes a really long time. And so part of what my hope for disability culture is, and part of the laughter, was that hopefully disability culture can bring people into the fold a little bit easier in a way that I think parasport does an incredible job within its own sort of subculture, if we can call it that.
John, you're part of the arts community, and you are as well, Carla. How have you found community and a common culture through the arts when it comes to disability culture?
I would say it's been astounding, actually. I mean, finding it had never occurred to me as a kid that I'd read a million books and seen all these movies and dreamed of being in these plays and all kinds of things without ever finding a character that reflected anything familiar to me. And it truly hadn't crossed my mind. And so it was when I started to trip across different types of writers. And so I'd gone into a writing workshop and, finding these stories that were told from the kind of like a perspective like mine, where a person does not know, like for my first 24 years, I wasn't diagnosed fully. And so we had kind of misconceptions about, and I only found out about ADHD when I was 40, but these kinds of combinations of what is different about how you learn, how you operate through the world, what your mind naturally gains and what your body might hold you back from. But we're all kind of on these storylines of independence and this solid, like, I can do everything by myself. But when I started to see stories that were actually on the interdependent topic and looking at characters or thoughts of the experience of like how much it can help someone emotionally and on a philosophical level and on the growth that they attain in life, to just see, be looking into a mirror and seeing a story like themselves instead of looking into a window and looking into a totally different world when you pick up a book. And I really wish, I think that's a quote by Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, a Black literacy educator. But when I found those kinds of other resources of people, and it wasn't always just disability, that got me really curious about that topic of just lives that are different from the ones we've seen in media and the books that we all studied in high school, that sort of thing. Getting a real different perspective of what the story could be centered around. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, today we are joined here on Blue Sky by disabled freelance journalist John Lepke, former Paralympian Shauna Ryan, and multidisciplinary artist Carla Harris. We will get back to the conversation in just a moment, but first let's check in with David Shield. David, what's making news?
The legal saga around the province's school pronoun policy continues. The province has filed an appeal saying a judge shouldn't have allowed a review on whether the law violates a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Earlier this year, the province invoked the notwithstanding clause on the policy, which supersedes the charter. This weekend's snowstorm inconvenienced a lot of people in Saskatoon, but it hit the food bank especially hard. The city's food bank was closed on Monday and Tuesday. That means many people went days without access to food. And there is a travel not recommended advisory on Highway 1 between Whitewood to Wolseley. Highways is reporting poor visibility, snowdrifts, and swirling snow. It's also reporting poor visibility in the southwest around Estevan, Carlisle, and Moosomin. And I'll have a full newscast for you coming up at 1 o'clock.
Thank you, David.
You're welcome.
I'm Candice Lipsky. I'm filling in for Alicia Grabinski today. You are listening to Blue Sky, and today we're talking about disability culture. Not a trauma experience, something that happened to you, but something that unites you and connects you with others. I would love to hear your thoughts. You can call right now, 1-800-716-2221, or you can email bluesky@cbc.ca. John Lepke, how do you think the concept of disability culture has evolved over time?
I think that disability culture, we're still really in the infancy on the scale of things to be willing to talk about it. And I think the stage that we're at is really looking at our, to borrow a term from American disability culture in a way, we're looking at our ancestors in a way. We're looking at that framework of, who have we left behind as disabled? Who have we decided to take the disability part out? There's a number of American presidents, for example, where we only talk about their disabilities when it is convenient, or, oh, look, there's a photo of him in a wheelchair. We really can't get around it. And so I think that being able to grow that disability culture and in its stages allows us to have deep conversations about what sort of disability culture means in the arts and what disability culture means in parasport, because my experiences of those are radically different, but from the same root of wanting to be inclusive and accessible. They just go about it in radically different ways. Again, only in my experience. So, how can we grow that to be? There's no point in making a disability culture that is uninclusive. So the joy of this stage of disability culture, I think, particularly in Saskatchewan, is being able to build it in the image that we want to see it in, rather than in some pre-described, oh, that's what the Brits did in the 90s. Okay, cool. But we can go a very prairie direction if we want.
We might have to, but I do want to talk about the fact that you in your video mentioned the importance of representation in the arts and sports world with examples like Frida Kahlo and Team Canada athletes, as you've talked about here today too. And I'm wondering how representation contributes to the visibility and acceptance of disability culture. I think Carla was talking about that too, that seeing yourself is so important. So John, how does representation contribute to all of this?
I think disability culture, particularly from a representation point of view, is really important because the history of disability activism, which I would put sort of within disability culture and sort of one of the driving forces, we talk about advocacy and sort of the second breath often in many of these disability conversations. Those conversations, and I say this as an ambulatory wheelchair user white guy, but they have been led by very active, largely white people, or those are the people who have been given the mic. And so part of representation is making sure that as we build disability culture, we are looking at things like the Festival of Literary Diversity and looking at books brought forward by BIPOC disabled writers. Like, part of the importance is being able to see representation and not just being, I hate to use this word, but I'm going to use it anyway, just being happy that disabled people are being represented and actually thinking about what that representation means, not just for like our generation of disabled people, but further on.
Shauna talked about John just talked about the arts there, but in what ways do you believe that participation in adaptive sports, such as cycling, for example, contributes to the broader understanding and acceptance of disability within society?
Well, I guess I would say the root of it is opportunity. So I always harken back very brief story. When I was first entering university, the Disabled Students Coordinator, as they were called at the time, he said to me, I'm not here to provide you with successes. I'm here to provide you with opportunities, and then what you choose to do with them is totally up to you. And there was no judgment either way. He's like, you can carry on in university or you can choose not to, but here I'm, making things... he was aiding me and enabling me to carry on in post-secondary pursuits. And I think that's the same thing. So we start out with providing people opportunities, and then I think that's how so that's sort of opening up the doors, providing that advocacy and that accessibility, and then we choose what we do with it. So that's how we then, as people with disabilities, begin to change that culture as well. And that culture is extremely diverse. So I hope, and John can maybe comment more on this, because he's worked on this longer than I have, but that definition is fluid, because the community is so large. So I think we need to really be willing to shift and keep that a nice fluid and inclusive definition.
John, you're nodding. Tell me about, what are you thinking about when you're thinking about the fluidity of this?
Absolutely. I was just thinking as we were talking about, and I have a bit part in this story, so apologies, listeners, you get to hear about me again. I bought my first basketball wheelchair from Colette Begonia, who's a very established Paralympian. That's putting it mildly. I always lose track of how many times she went to the Paralympics, so if Colette's listening, she can call in, right? I bought my first basketball chair from her. Basketball being a sport she didn't really play by the time I got around to buying a chair. And I went skiing with her as well. She's got a school named after her now in Saskatoon, and she's doing incredible work advocating and teaching that next generation, as she has for many years. This is not a new development of Paralympians. And I think the definition broadens as we expand that group, and as we, to go back to the representation point, as we recognize people who have been doing this work for a long time, whether or not they labeled it a disability culture at the time. Like, it is a label that we can sort of put onto things. In a way, for a community that doesn't like labels, we also really like labels when they benefit us. And I think disability culture is one of those that can do that.
I'm Candice Lipsky. You are listening to Blue Sky here on CBC Radio 1. You're listening on 540 AM across the province, 94.1 FM in Saskatoon, 102.5 FM in Regina. And you can also listen on the CBC Listen app. If you have to go somewhere and you want to keep listening, that is the way to keep listening. Our guests today is John Lepke. He's a disabled freelance journalist. Shauna Ryan is a former Paralympian. And Carla Harris is a multi-disciplinary artist. Now, Carla, I want to go back to you. Everything we've been talking about has been excitingly positive, but I do think that there's probably still challenges here. So, Carla, what challenges do you think there are in raising awareness and understanding of disability culture?
Honestly, Candice, I would say the biggest barrier is truly the way that people with disabilities tend to be underemployed, undersupported, have higher costs of living due to conditions that need treatment or equipment that they need support with, or assistance that they may need for different elements of their conditions. And often there are resources, or with certain types like adult ADHD diagnosis, so many of us can't just go and buy this piece of equipment. We need to have resources that we can access, because for so many folks, just growing up and going to school, that's kind of enough for you to find work and be able to support yourself in a financial way that manages things. But when you've got other folks who have, like, my medication cost is $20,000 a year. If I don't have a job that will cover that securely, it really, makes even just the everyday things in life. It's not even so much a question of how that impacts, my health. We know that. The larger thing, which I found kind of in a long story that I won't get into, where I had a period of looking for other work, realizing how much harder it is for workplaces that maybe do things as a one-way only. Like, everybody comes into this office and immediately has the same type of a desk and applies for the job online and stuff. Those are the things that we don't have enough access support, because as soon as a person can have just certain amounts of their life where they know they have the control, they have the ability to look for other jobs, or they have the ability to find something that really fits their skills, where they can be proud of what they work on or proud of what they do, and that can make your whole life so much less stressful. That's what has allowed me to become a writer, finding access to work that, looks after some of those other security things. So truly, in my mind, since so many of us cannot be healthy and maintain, our own lives and everything working in a 40-hour week, we need to look for ways to, make adaptations to people who can work from home. We need to find positions that can be created that will fit other sets of skills, or, people that use other types of equipment to do work, so that they can contribute with every company, right? Mm-hmm. Like, as long as I'm not purchasing, there was a really great study a number of years ago done by Mark Walter, I think. I'm really bad with memory. Sorry about this.
That's okay.
But he's a gentleman in Toronto that owns a couple of Tim Hortons, and has a vast majority of his staff at all of his locations are actually people with disabilities. And he really talks about, how the benefit of having just our lives safe, independent, like having that element there allows people to do so much more in all of the other goals that they have, and beyond. And so those are the kinds of things that I've wound up really getting obsessed with once I'd gone through working with people, and realizing that so much of the privilege that I have is because I was diagnosed later, because I am capable. I might do very different ways of thinking, and it might be really annoying to train me when I join your company. However, I'm very quick working, and I have other knowledge and other resources to bring to the table. Like, Mark's company out there had done a set of reports for the National Disability Employment Awareness Month.
Right.
I think it's October, but I have a horrible memory again. But one of the things that they were talking about is, if you're looking at families that have someone with a disability in their family, that's actually like 90%, right? So that's, if you're looking at, is your restaurant, for example, accessible for all of the people in that family? And knowing that that's going to change over the course of time. Like, right now, we just have a big group of baby boomers who may not like a title like this, but these are practical things that, by bringing folks like John or me or, Shauna, all kinds of people who live with this as our normal, we have options and ideas. And that's what we just have to like find ways to get that to work in a way that doesn't have to be 40 hours a week.
Yeah, and I'm actually really curious, Shauna, about your thoughts on kind of some of those solution ideas. So I'm curious, what advice would you give to individuals, maybe communities who are looking to engage with disability culture and support the inclusion of disabled people in various aspects of society? And beyond that, if there's a role for allies in all of this?
100%. I come at this from a wide variety of lenses because I was raised, first of all, by parents who expected me to do everything. So I always say, by no stretch of the imagination was I coddled. And so sometimes, reflecting back on that, I'm extremely grateful. As a parent, I also know it's very hard to let my kids don't have any disabilities, obvious disabilities that I'm aware of. They obviously have their challenges. And it's even hard to let them try things. And so, being brave as parents, teachers, care providers, to let kids, teenagers try things and not limit them by what we expect them to be able to do. So challenging our own assumptions. I think then as educators, being creative, although we know that's challenging, working with other allies to be able to provide those opportunities for sport, for education, for art. And then I think, which has been a bit of an elephant in the room here, not medicalizing things. And I work as an occupational therapist, and I also work as with the med college. And I think there are slow shifts happening in terms of making, much like John pointed out very aptly, making this more of a collaborative effort as opposed to something we do to people with disabilities. So really opening up avenues for collaboration, having advisory boards, getting people involved, getting the discussion going. Because I think if we're discussing really with excellent collaborative hearts, we can continue to have this happening, this shift moving forward.
John, we have about 2 minutes left, but I want to give you the last word because you were kind of the inspiration behind all of this. So I'm wondering if you want to just kind of wrap things up for us and tell us about the significance of seeing disability as a culture rather than, solely as a medical or social issue, as Shauna just mentioned, particularly in terms of, fostering inclusivity and understanding.
Sure. This is one of the contexts where I'm fine with being called an inspiration. It's a nice tone change from what I might get out on the street. I think my last note on disability culture is that we have a habit when it comes to disability is always wanting to look forward. We always want to, even when we're doing diversity, equity, inclusion work, well, here's what we're doing now. Okay, how do we atone, both in disability community and outside of it, for who we've left behind, right? We have tended to leave behind those with intellectual and developmental disabilities for much the same reason as I was horrified to feel near some people when I was a young child. It is because we have built this idea that there is a good disabled person and there is a bad disabled person in society. It's what a lot of what Carla was speaking on. And I think disability culture allows us to look back at people and look back towards a history and actually see how long the knowledge of disabled people is. And that's not to say disabled people knew better. No. But it is to say that it is a long-reaching history that disability culture as a lens now can help us look through.
I have learned so much today. I want to thank all of our panelists so much for joining us. John Lepke is a disabled freelance journalist. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you for having me.
Shauna Ryan is a former Paralympian. Thank you so much, Shauna.
Thank you so much. This is great.
And Carla Harris is a multi-disciplinary artist. Thank you so much, Carla.
I really appreciate it. Thanks.